Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 102nd episode of the CDO Matters podcast. This is Malcolm Hawker. I'm your host. I'm thrilled that you are joining us today. This is the podcast for chief data officers or anybody that wants to be a chief data officer. I'm I'm excited for today's conversation. We're going to talk with Jain. Anu is the founder and CEO of Nexus One. We're going to get into that a little bit. We're going to talk about data sprawl. We're going to talk about what Anu calls the first mile of data all over the place, data sources everywhere, and how to kind of get your hands around that. We're gonna talk about maybe solutions in the market. We're going to talk about architectures. We're going to talk about data management disciplines. There's no doubt that data sprawl is a huge issue, and I think that that's something that we're going to go into depth with today. So, Anu, with that, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Awesome. You are in Atlanta. My company is based in Atlanta. You've got this interesting history. You you go back and forth between like really large companies having important roles at like super large companies. Like you led a services branch at Teradata. You were heavily involved at IBM, and then you go like into founder mode, and then you go back to big companies, and then you go into founder mode. That's a bit unique. Do you agree? Usually, people will stay one or the other. What gives you the dexterity to go back and forth between these two worlds?
I'm not sure if it's dexterity or if I'm a masochist.
All right.
Like every other chief data officer here, we're probably all masochists to some level or degree. No, look, I think the reality is I'm unique in the way that I've had the ability and the privilege of being able to see the world, especially from the data world, from the vantage point of very large organizations, whether it's with Watson,
Yeah.
leading large parts of IBM, or with Teradata, we're seeing some of the largest data environments in the world, and it's always given me the what's the right word here? It's just the energy to want to go solve it in a different way, and I think there's just so much sprawl out there, and there's just so many tools and technologies and consultants trying to solve this. I just thought there's a better way, and what better way than just to go try to solve it?
I shared that. One of the reasons why I went to work for Prophecy and why I left Gardner is because I saw so much dysfunction when I was at Gardner. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way. And I don't mean it in a negative way, but being exposed to that world, I saw maybe the better way to say it instead of being negative is opportunity, right? Like there's just
Yeah,
what I
this is
saw just every day, so much opportunity. And I'm approaching that not by founder mode or not going into founder mode, but in evangelist mode, spreading the word and trying to get best practices out there. So anyway, we maybe kind of share the desire to fix things. Maybe that's what we both have in common. But let's talk about this idea of like data all over the place, data sprawl. I was reading a report earlier today from Dresser Analytics said that on average companies have almost 80 sources of data. I was like, wow, that's it. And I was looking at an IDG report that they did with Matillion a couple of years back, where they were saying that on average companies have more than 400 sources of data, and that 20% of the companies in the survey had over 1,000.
yeah.
It's like this to me is a massive opportunity, but also a massive problem. When you hear these types of numbers, what do you think?
I think first and foremost, data hasn't been a first class citizen for many of these organizations. We talk about this word of data sprawl, but when you talk about the number of sources out there, it feels like that's actually underreported. I think what we're hearing are official sources of data. I sense that there's many unofficial sources of data as well, whether it's spreadsheets, whether it's third-party SaaS apps that you have out there, data across multi-cloud, legacy data that we haven't even thought about yet. And all of that information, all that data has value. It has some sort of information yield, like some sort of value to that information. And I think companies today are enterprises of all sorts are struggling to get yield out of all of this data that they have. and they're struggling with the old concepts of let's build the intergalactic data warehouse. You remember, let's just if we just throw it all into a big ass database, it's gonna be amazing.
You work for Teradata. That was the business model.
It was a great business model, yes, but it's tough. It's tough because why is it tough? First, you're going to find out where all this information's at. You're going to bring it to one place. You actually have to define it. You don't even know what most of this, where this information resides at today. And typically, what do most companies do? They're actually replicating the same information over and over again versus driving to get yield out of it. And then you have probably 80% of the data underneath the iceberg, if you will, is still unknown to them and unknown context. And is it valuable? And I sort of feel this is going to extrapolate to a much bigger problem, especially in this world today, right? In the last 120 days with the agentic harnesses, and everyone's talking about agents and AI. Well, what do you need? You need great data, you need great context, you need great governance, and we're gonna have to get to that pretty darn quickly.
Yeah. Some would argue that it should have happened a few years ago, but it's interesting. I agree. I think the number of sources is probably underreported. And I think you're probably right, where if you ask, it's kind of like the forest you see in front of you versus the forest you don't see, or the world that you don't see, right? I suspect, Gardner's correct. 80 to 90% of the data in most companies is unstructured and completely outside the scope of most governance programs. So I'd be willing to bet that if you ask the data leader how many sources of data, that's basically the same thing as asking how many ETL processes are you running, how many pipelines are you running. Oh, I've got 400 of those. But then how many other sources out there are you like just completely off the radar? That makes sense to me. That is huge opportunity, but also risk. No,
Well, look, it's a huge risk. I'll tell you, it's actually funny. I love that you said unstructured data. It was something I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, here at Nexus One, with all the agentic harnesses out there, I challenged our team to build a Nexus One brain. So to take our product, but basically, I want to pull all information of the company into one place. So that's not only what we have in our core data systems, like our finance systems and HR systems and CRM systems, but let's pull all the Slack data. And then, of course, for myself, I said, I have a human chief of staff, and he knows I tell him this all the time, but I want an agentic chief of staff now. So now what does that mean? It has to listen to all my conversations. And we have to pull all that data and context as well. And you start to play this out we're a smaller enterprise, but you start playing this out for a larger enterprise. Can you imagine how hard that is? And that's not just pulling the unstructured data, it's the governance, it's the security of it, as well. And so I think it's going to become a really fun problem for all of us to go start to unpack together.
you mentioned something earlier that we just take for granted. And anytime we take something for granted, I think that's an opportunity to revisit from a first principles perspective on, should we really be doing that? And that's the issue of replication, right? Like you just mentioned it, but we do this all the time. Like we replicate data out of source systems. We'll drop tables, replicate tables all the time because storage has become reasonably cheap. I mean, cheaper than it was 10 years ago, most certainly, and easier than it was 10 years ago with Lakehouse. I mean, like, I don't have to do anything. I just dump it all into wherever. But that duplication thing, when I think about it from a first principles perspective, do we really need to keep doing that? Is that something that you and your team are thinking about?
Yeah, it's something we spend a lot of time on. Actually, it was one of the reasons we started Nexus One. And there was a metric that came to me in my prior role when I was CEO of Think Big. And we had asked all of our clients, we had about 1,800 clients at any one time around the world. And we asked them a very simple question. Out of the project you're doing today, right? How much of this data of this new project is a replica of the data you used in your last set of projects? And what we found in this quick study of data of metrics of these clients was 90% of the data of a net new project was a replica of the data they used in the last 5 projects. So it was about replicating the redundancy of data, not actually driving to yield, information yield. And so we think a lot about we shouldn't be spending the amount of time on building ETL or ELT jobs and data transformation all over the place without common yield to that information set. And so we have a very strong belief in virtualization technologies. We rely heavily on Trino. There's a lot of updates we do to it, but really let the data live where it does, and go to that data and pull it when needed. Bring the data engine to the data versus bringing the data to the engine. And we've seen by doing that, just completely, it changes the equation of the cost equation of what it takes to manage your data. But secondarily, the time it takes you to deploy net new capabilities in your enterprise goes from months and years or months and quarters down to days and literally no more than 2 weeks to deploy new capabilities. And it's something that I think, as a CDO and with all the pressure we get from the businesses today, the ability to deploy faster and governed really matters. And we see data virtualization as one of the fastest way to get to that point.
So, in my past, when I've gone deep in these discussions with people, I've asked questions like, "Okay, do we need to really start replicating data? Do we even need a data warehouse?" A lot of these, and that's slightly rhetorical, but I would like your opinion on it. All those conversations inevitably end up at this place where it's like fast read versus fast write, and the physics of a hard drive, and we will always need some idea of a data warehouse because we need to be able to aggregate a lot of data at scale and do like fast reads, and then there's OLAP, OLTP, and I get all of that stuff. But in my experience, anytime the technology is the only barrier, right, the technology is the only barrier, that to me is like, oh, okay, it's not going to stay this way. It can't always stay this way. So I'm not trying to get all philosophical about analytics infrastructure versus operational infrastructure, but you seem to be suggesting that these things could potentially have the kind of mudge into one thing.
Yeah, I love the provocative question here, which is, does the world change and is virtualization the only way to go? Look, my view of today, the view of today versus the view of tomorrow is, today I would start with virtualization and I would harden those things that need to be hardened because of business need or business SLA, when and how needed. The reality is, we're moving to a world where more will be virtualized versus less, but that's going to create a world in where fine grained access controls to the data is important, governance is important, lineage is important. But then on top of that, it's the context, right? Because what really matters is the way we interact with data is going to become very different. We're seeing it. We've all had a chat GPT moment or a Claude moment. Maybe some of you guys have had your open Claude moment at this point, or Hermes moment at this point. But the reality is we're going to be interacting with our data in many different ways. And the context is going to matter there more than the structure. So it's going to be governance, it's going to be metadata, it's going to be security that matters. Where we store it and how we access it will change. And I think technology is moving so rapidly, so is compute, to a world where virtualization will become more of the answer than less of the answer. Right. And I'd say everyone's going to give you edge cases of where it makes sense to persist data, not persist data. To me, that's de minimis to the fact of we need to make the information highly usable and governed and do that at scale.
Well, I don't know if this was intentional, but you used the word information, which a nerd like me would say, okay, that's slightly different than data because it's richer than data. Information is data with context in it, and if that was a conscious decision, I'm all in. So I'm trying
By
to
the
get my
way,
head. Go ahead.
it absolutely was a conscious decision. And you probably heard me use the word information yield.
Yes.
And I started using that word more and more was I believe enterprises and CDOs in in the aggregate are going to have to at some point report on information yield, which is what is the value of the data and how am I extracting information out of it. So if we think of CDOs as refineries, it's I have all this raw data in my company. How am I enabling the organization to extract value? And can I put a metric to that value that I'm extracting? And I'd given this a lot of thought. There was years ago, Walmart used to report on information yield in their earnings report. They used to talk about this. And then it kind of went away. And then I literally just heard a podcast with Arvind, the CEO of IBM. And he said, companies today are going to be talking about data as a financial asset in the company and trying to quantify what the information they can extract from their data, and how important is that to their competitive advantage in moats in the future. And so I think it's one of those things I'm trying to bring back is how do we all start talking about information yield and how are we extracting that value? So yeah, short answer is yes, it was absolutely very intentional.
I love the optimism. I really love the optimism, but I'll tell you, this is a big one. Meaning quantifying the business benefits of the stuff that we do, because just most of us don't, right? And this was my biggest frustration as a Gartner analyst for 3 years, talking to CIOs and CDOs all day, every day. We had data that we had like actual data that showed, okay, when you quantify what you're calling information yield, I could call it business outcome, business benefits, when you put a number on it, right? When you do that, you prolong investments, you increase investments, you prolong your tenure, your customers are happier, good things happen, release the doves, the angels are going to sing. Nobody did it. Like nobody did it. So what do you think will be the driving force here of CDOs tracking information yield, or maybe CFOs or whoever, I don't care, somebody tracking the information yield? What is going to be the lightning rod moment that will make companies start doing
I think we're in it today. We're in it now. We're in the AI moment. The AI moment is going to force us all to treat data as a strategic asset in the business. And let's just play it out, right? Let me kind of play out why I think that is the case. Let's start with just the basic standpoint of openness. We're already starting to see companies talk about openness of my data and how I exchange data between my applications. Whether you were Slack, who closed down their ecosystem and started a whole set of conversations. Now you saw Salesforce go to headless, right? But the reality is, how do I have open exchange of my information across my apps today? And those who are not open, I believe will have a harder time. So those who are trying to build closed ecosystems versus open ecosystems of the corporate data. The second is sovereignty, right? I can tell you with many conversations I have, and I'll break it up between both regulated industries and non-regulated. Every organization that's regulated today that I've had a conversation with, whether it's banking, whether it's telco, whether it's healthcare, government, are having the conversation around sovereignty of my data, which is, do I want all my data even in the cloud anymore? Do I want it in someone who's taking it and enriching it? Do I want it going to a third-party LLM provider, or do I want to host my data back on-prem or in my own virtual private cloud where I have total ownership of what's going on in it and the derivative products of it, the ontologies of my data? We are seeing that moment today. Then the third is we're thinking about AI agents and tokens, right? And in order to have good AI agents, you need to have good data infrastructure, good security, good context. But the token layer, if you will, and companies will start to build their own ways of hosting their own LLMs or SLMs, things I call compound AI, probabilistic and deterministic AI internally. But that cost equation is going to force the question of, where do I deploy agents? On what data do I deploy the agents? How do I deploy it? Is it deterministic or is it probabilistic? Right now, we're making everything to a probabilistic model. we'll see the resurgence of ML, I believe, because it's a lower cost way of getting to answers. And we're in that moment today. Uber's CTO just came out with 2 weeks ago, said, I read out on my entire token budget for the year in Q1. And so AI slop will drive toward us getting a lot smarter about data and context and and what data is important to drive what outcomes. I fully see that coming. I think it'll be one of the biggest conversations we'll have between now and the end of this year. I don't think this is a 2-year prediction. I think this is an in-year 2026 prediction.
Ooh, bold. Okay, that's bold. So half of what you said, I'm not there. The other half, I'm completely there. So the first half basically was governance. In essence, right? And that understanding provenance, understanding lineage, understanding risk, data sharing, right? So we talked about open standards. I'm all for, by the way, I'm open standards in data. We'll never get companies to agree on any sort of like metadata standards. My goodness, we've been talking about metadata standards as long as we've had metadata. Going back to like semantic web, for heaven's sakes, I don't think we're ever going to get there. I think the AI will actually help us act as this translation layer. You call it account, I call it customer, somebody else calls it prospect. Who cares? I think the AI can figure that out. The second thing that you talked about, though, I heard over and over and over again at Gartner. So the first thing that I heard at Gartner Data and Analytics Summit over and over and over again was context, context, context. If I had $1 for every time I heard context, I don't know, I'd buy a nice car. But the thing that I heard the most was, and I hate this phrase, I think it's kind of pithy and a little dumb, but what Gartner calls FinOps, financial operations. Basically, what you're talking about, be smart about how you consume tokens, right? And don't consume thousands of dollars in tokens on a project that isn't cost justified, right? Or don't go consume thousands of tokens in trying to cram so much text into a context window because you're trying to drive deterministic behaviors out of a probabilistic system.
Yes.
Right. Which is what you touched on with the whole deterministic and ML returning. Totally agree with that. Because what I see now is like you can make LLMs act very deterministically, but how much context, how much do you actually stuff in the context window and give it one prompt, right? To get that behavior that you want when maybe it's just an ML problem. So financial operations and maturity around making sure that you're not spending us into oblivion, that could make CDOs figure it out.
It's going to come, but the problem is not everyone, but a majority of folks today want to use LLMs to solve everything. And they're a purpose-built tool. And so you could spend, and I just saw this with a client of ours where we're doing a real-time AI solution for intent information, where we're trying to use an LLM to do reasoning on categories. And it made much more sense to be done in ML with some basic reasoning follow-up with the LLM. So they're going to run in parallel, but the prior model, they could have bankrupted their company. I mean, I'm sure our friends at Claude or OpenAI would love that. But the reality is the CDO is going to become the governance layer very quickly for this, because everyone's going to point to him saying, I don't have the context, I don't have the data, I don't have this, I don't have that, I don't have the tooling. And then we're going to have to bring that tooling to the masses and make it really, really easy to use. And, that's something that, myself as the CEO of Nexus One, given a lot of thought to it, is how we build out our own products to enable this, especially for sovereign estates. But it's an area that I believe it's going to be, it's coming with a vengeance.
It's inevitable
conversations.
It's inevitably coming. This reminds me so much at the beginning of the explosion of AWS, right? And cloud compute in general, right? So AWS comes on the scene. And at the time, I was running an IT shop for a $2 billion company. And we had an official AWS account with AWS, but then there was all of these shadow accounts across the entire organization where it was engineers on their credit cards spinning up AWS instances, and they were all over the organization, and they were getting expensed I went to I went to our finance group and said, can you give me a summary of all expense payments that were to AWS?" And it was hundreds of thousands of dollars being expensed every month that I didn't know about. And I'm the guy responsible for cloud infrastructure, and all this money was going out the door that I didn't know about, which led to the birth of these management planes where it's okay, centralized management of the spend, of turning up, turning down. It's the exact same thing. So completely agree with you.
But just I think this, and I'm going to cut you off for 1 second,
No, no, go.
leads to the problem of, let's go back to the AWS problem, which was, what did most companies do? They didn't modernize their systems. They encapsulated it. It's like encapsulating nuclear waste, and I moved it to the cloud. We didn't modernize it for cloud. We didn't modernize it for containerization, Kubernetes, or any of the things that are happening. Now the AI moment has come, and let me use a different analogy here. I had the privilege of working with a restructuring firm years ago, and I was doing consulting, SI work. And the restructuring guy slapped his hand on the table. He goes, "Anu, I figured out what you guys call transformation, right? Versus restructuring." He goes, "It takes you guys 5 times as long and 20 times as much money to do a transformation than it does us to do a restructuring." And I believe we're in the world of AI restructuring. And what does that mean? That means our data estates that are sprawling, sometimes 70-year-old data estates, right, from mainframe all the way through all these different technologies, are going to have to be modernized in a way to allow for this new AI layer. And so it's like the old manor house that's been built over a couple of centuries. And we're going to have to get ready for the new guest in the house, which is AI. And that means we're going to have to modernize. And so the other trick that's coming, and it's something we spend a lot of time at Nexus One, and others do too. It's how do you get to one touch or zero touch migration and modernization of this old data estate to a new modern estate where we have the tooling enabled to do the FinOps, but also to manage the AI, manage the tokens, manage the context, manage the fine grained access control that these capabilities are going to need. Because it's no longer just querying reporting.
So I could agree more. The guest is coming. Guest is already here. I think the guest is living in the basement. Uh, and we're kind of doing our best to make sure that she or he gets fed every now and then, and there's a natural source of light maybe trickling in from a tiny little window. But I don't think that we're doing the most that we can. But I think you're right on this process reengineering thing, and I think it is exactly why Salesforce bought Informatica. It's exactly why SAP bought Reltio, why ServiceNow acquired Datadog World and others. Is that we need to the greatest value is going to come from process reengineering, right? It's going to come. Everybody knows this, right? You basically just said that in essence. I'm paraphrasing. But the greatest value is not going to come from chatbots that can regurgitate your customer service FAQs. It's going to come from re-architecting these legacy processes that were defined, under Deming standards 40 years ago. TQM stuff from go way, way, way back in the day that really hasn't been changed or challenged. And the only way we're going to do that is with this data estate, right? And if the data is no bueno, we got a problem.
And it's really tough, right? Because now you got to have one control plane across your entire data estate. And I'm talking my book a little bit, but my view of the world is why we started Nexus One was, initially, you got to have one plane across your entire data estate, whether it's on-prem, whether it's in cloud, whether it's in virtual private cloud. Your data is heterogeneous, right? It's across multiple on-prem, Excel, all of this stuff. So at a minimum, you need one pane of glass to manage it all. And then you need to understand how to modernize those systems, encapsulate them, modernize them, and bring these capabilities to bear, because AI is going to want to go through every part of your data estate. It's going to want to go everywhere. and it needs the ability. You hear the word context. Context is great, but we still got to not only give context, security, governance to all data, and that means all of our data also has to have a digital birth certificate. Where did it come from? How did it get here? What does it mean? Right? Otherwise, we're going to get bad answers from our data, and AI is really convincing at giving really bad answers sometimes. And the best way I have to describe this is if we go back in the time machine to, Malcolm, you and I are a little older. We can go back 25 years ago, and when we get the birth of these web BI tools, what was the first thing that happened when it went to the masses? Everyone could do a Cartesian join in a BI tool, and they had an answer. But without the context, the answer doesn't matter, right? And same thing's going to happen here if we don't start to get control of these data states, but at a much faster scale.
Yeah, that for sure. So I agree on the single control plane. However, there is a large sect of us who are really focused on decentralization and see the idea of a single control plane as inefficient. I don't agree. I don't agree. What's your pushback to that?
I'm going to push back, but I think that there's two parts to that. There's an and and an or, right? So my point of view is it's and, not or. So most folks in the world, in this data world today, say life would be awesome if all your data resided in my control plane, which also meant all your data must be in my data system. They're not different.
Yeah.
My format, my system, I control, I govern all your data. So if you're a Bricks, you're a Snowflake, I'll make fun of them. They're the two big guys on the block, but what do they say? You put all my data in my estate and you're awesome. Except if I have data in an on-prem system, I have data in another ERP, what am I doing? I'm replicating the data back to that data state to be in that control plane. No. What I'm saying is the control plane is across your entire data state where the data resides at. And so we have to be very thoughtful about so and, not or. And
I
so
don't know how you avoid that, right? I don't know how you avoid that. I've wrestled with this for 30 years, right? And this pendulum swing back and forth, centralization, decentralization, centralization, decentralization. Yeah, we need a data mesh, and all centralization is bad. No, it's not all bad. Because if your CEO asks how many customers do we have, you better have one answer quick.
Yeah, but you have both, but that doesn't take away from having one control plane, right? You're going to have some data that's centralized and is a golden record. You're going to have some data that's decentralized, which doesn't have a lot of yield value to being centralized. That's okay as well. But you need to have context, governance, security, all the digital birth certificate of all that data. At least, I hate to use this word orchestrated. It sounds like a data movement word, but managed to some degree. And we see tremendous amount of value from that today.
Yes, I would argue it's necessary, right? Putting on my analyst hat, if I was sitting at that whiteboard behind you, I would draw a 3-ring Venn diagram, right? And sometimes the data is on the outside ring and nobody cares, and it's sitting in Salesforce, and it's one of the 4,000 custom fields you've built in Salesforce, and it only lives in Salesforce, and it never goes anywhere else. Nobody cares. Knock yourself out. Decentralize. I got it. Yeah.
It's a Z table in SAP. A lot of folks have them. Great. Go forth and conquer.
Speaking of SAP, speaking of big companies that are trying to force you into their standards. Anywho.
Yes.
But then the middle of that Venn diagram, most of our high value processes, the workflows that we were talking about, like re-automating these processes, like quote to cash, procure to pay, data is shared across them. It's widely shared across them. So the idea that you could have complete decentralization and who cares, everybody wins, right? And everybody can have their own definition of customer. Well, that may be fine at an operating level. But again, if your CFO asks how many customers do we have, or if you're trying to put it on your annual report that gets reported to Wall Street, you better be confident that you've got the one right answer to that. So that is your or your and, right? It's the that and.
Yeah, that's yes. And the decentralized. You're going to have both. I don't see there's a world where it's 100% decentralized. And also there's a world where it's 100% centralized. We've tried the 100% centralized world. That just led to lots of money for SIs.
Yeah. Yeah. It's called
You
Siebel.
know,
Yeah.
exactly. But you're going to have both, but you need to. But our opportunities to manage all of that data, both where it lives and where we give it a golden set of truths for the organization.
Now you're talking my language. You're talking MDM. So let's. In our last couple of minutes, you've used the phrase digital birth certificate twice now, and I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued, and because I'm gonna show my nerdiness here. And I talked about this maybe like in episode 2 or 3 of my podcast, and I haven't talked about it much because, frankly, it's not as popular as it used to be. And I love the idea of some form of blockchain here, right? Some form of immutable ledger that forever captures your digital birth
I love it.
certificate. And maybe it's an NFT. I'm fine with that too. But something on a chain that is tightly governed. He said, what's your response to my ranking just now? What do you think? Is that a viable approach to solve for your digital birth certificate?
You must have seen my Twitter account. You must have seen my Twitter account at some point. I'm a big blockchain nerd
No.
as well. No, so look,
Yes.
we actually spent a lot of time early on in the history of Nexus doing blockchain work as well. And we thought about this control plane idea and everything being a blockchain itself, along with the digital birth certificate. We connect to many blockchains. We do a lot of work even in the SUI ecosystem, and I can go on and on. But the reality is I have a very strong belief of the same, right? That your digital birth certificate will be immutable for that piece of data, and it needs to be stored in an immutable fashion, right? Especially with the generative technologies that are out there. And whether you call it NFT or whatever we want to call it, there's an immutable record of the birth of that data, and then how that data has been migrated, transposed across the enterprise. And it frankly, it's going to have to be there, I think, over time to have a level of truth in what we report on and what we decision upon.
Well, it's interesting. I listen to people in the data world describe requirements, right? And there's for something that looks like this digital birth certificate, if you want to call it that. But let's call it maybe a data contract, right? Maybe or some idea of a proven, stamped, validated, governed,
Data product, data contract,
artifact of fact, right? This article of fact. And data people will use words like data contracts, automated governance to describe things that have existed in blockchain for a long time. Smart contracts have existed a long time. NFTs, this immutable, trustworthy record of authenticity, has existed for a long time. So people in the data world use similar words to describe requirements that I would argue are well supported by this technology. But I don't know. Anyway, Anu, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. We have to end slightly abruptly today because we've had a technical problem. If you want to learn more, go to Nexus One, go to their website, learn what they're doing. I think they're doing some very, very cool stuff around this single plane, which I think is inevitable. I think we're going in that direction. Anu's publishing in Fortune magazine, which is incredible. And he's prolific on LinkedIn like me. Go check him out on LinkedIn. But for now, that's a wrap on episode 102. If you've made it this far, please take a moment to subscribe, to like, do all the things the socials prefer. Anu, although I can't hear you, thank you for attending. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Look forward to talking to you again another time soon. And with that, I will sign off. See you on another episode. I'm losing my voice. My goodness, it's just everything's going to heck here. We'll see you on another episode of the CDO Matters podcast out there very soon. Bye for now.